Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. You could just settle down. Thank you so much for coming. This is the fourth in the series of for the Archives Public Lecture Series. For those of you who don't know, we are setting up an archive at NCBS, and we see it as a space for looking at the history of contemporary biology in India. We will not be anywhere close to that aim in the first few years when we start, but that's the general direction in which we are headed. So do spread the word. We'll be open later this year. So as part of this outreach that we do, we try to run this monthly public lecture series, and as mentioned, this is the fourth in the series, and we'll do it once a month, typically in the second half of the month. So it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Balaji Parthasarathy. Balaji is on the faculty at IIIT Bangalore. His research and training interests are in the social and political consequences of globalization, technological change and innovation, and urban and regional geographies. Within this broad focus, his work follows two threads. One thread examines the impacts of public policy and firm strategies on the organization of production in the information and communications technology industry. Another thread deals with ICTs for development, or ICTD. Here his interests lie in understanding how ICTs are being deployed in various domains of activity to transform social relationships, especially in economically underprivileged contexts. In 2016, he published a book with Yuko Ayoma titled The Rise of the Hybrid Domain, Collaborative Governance for Social Innovation. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, most recently of the Samuel von Pufendorf Visiting Research Fellow at the Pufendorf Institute for Advanced Studies in 2017-18, an academic writing residency at the Rockefeller Foundation Balaji Center in Italy in 2015, and the Emerging Leader Fellowship at the Australia-India Institute, University of Melbourne in 2013. Balaji has a bachelor's and degree from the IIT Kharagpur and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, where his thesis work, which I guess sort of rounds up today, was on the state and information technology industry in Bangalore. Please give a warm welcome.
Thank you, Venkat, for that introduction. And it's my pleasure to be here at NCBS, and I'd like to thank the Institute for welcoming me to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a number of years. As the title says, historical accidents of path dependence, science, technology, industry, and the state in 20th century Bangalore. Now, what this talk is about is looking at certain socioeconomic ideas that influenced India in the 20th century, and their specific manifestation in this region that we live in today. Okay, but as an economic geographer, as somebody who works at the intersection of economic geography and economic sociology, the emphasis is on the spatial manifestation. I'm not a big historian of ideas per se, though I do sort of refer to that every now and then. So this is sort of the broad goal of this talk. The other thing I'd like to sort of mention up front is that, there's going to be no stunning new empirical revelation from an archive or any such thing in this talk. It's really pulling together many things that we already know and are aware of, and sort of looking at how is it that we might think of Bangalore and changes that have taken place here through certain broader transformations that have taken place in the country, right? All right. So let me again start with this sort of very well-known quote by Nehru when he said, Bangalore is a picture of India of the future, more specifically because of science, technology, and industries in the public sector here. And this was, something that he sort of talked about when he was addressing the Bangalore Municipal Corporation in 1962. Now, the argument that I'd like to make here is that it's useful indeed to sort of distinguish the sort of the post-independence economic transformation of Bangalore in sort of two broad phases. One from 1947 to the mid-1980s, and then a second phase after that when the whole sort of the software boom took off, and we have references to Bangalore being the Silicon Valley of India and other sort of fanciful claims, right? But it's also at the same time, I think, simplistic to think of one phase as being led by the state or the public sector and another by the private sector, ignoring the role of the state in both periods. And what's even more easily forgotten, I think, is the role of the state in the industrialization of pre-independence Mysore and how some of those ideas actually influenced post-independence India. Right? Thus, this self-presentation provides a means of understanding economic transformation in Bangalore in the 20th century as a sort of a reflection of the ways in which the state has intervened to play a developmental role. That is, a spatial manifestation of developmental thought. Right? Now, in other words, one of the things that I like to do here is to use the state as an explanatory variable. It's not the only variable, but that's what I'm going to be focusing on here. Okay? Now, when I talk about the state, let me sort of very quickly and briefly meander into the world of political sociology to talk about why is it that I'm sort of invoking the state here. What do we mean by the state? If you go back to sort of political sociology, works of Weber and others, a state is that institution which has a monopoly over violence in any given territory, right? Now, why is it that we need something like the state? It's just that if we didn't have some organization like that or an institution like that, given how fickle we are in our behavior, we might end up blooding the nose of our neighbor at the smallest grievance. At the same time, you might have others blooding our noses, right? Or 1.2 billion in this country, right? If we didn't have something called a state to maintain what, for example, going back to the colonial days, is called to maintain law and order, right? Now, essentially what this means then is a certain kind of a trade-off. You're willing to give up certain kinds of personal liberty in order to ensure that the state gives you something, certain security, some law and order, whatever. But that's the sort of a very minimalist state. Increasingly, especially over the last, say, century and a half, the state has had to sort of gain its legitimacy, right? In other words, saying, we take care of you and you're willing to trust the state in terms of delivering material well-being, increased standards of living, right? And that's been very crucial in ensuring that the state is actually able to maintain that legitimacy. The ideas of the state playing this kind of a transformative role, a developmental role, goes back to sort of the work of sort of the German political economist Friedrich List and so on. Okay, we won't get into those details now, but essentially the role of the state in ensuring economic development to create local industries, to create local economic development without leaving things to sort of this quote-unquote the free market, if one such entity even exists, right, has been sort of very well documented in history. Now, in the Indian context, right, the post-independence state, right, had a significant or gained a lot of its legitimacy with, you had, leaders who had fought for the independence, right, people like Nehru and Gandhi and others. But it was essentially Nehru whose ideas eventually prevailed for a variety of reasons, right? Again, it's a history that I won't go into. Gandhi passed away, Patel passed away, but there were one or two people who were sort of naysayers, and I'll get to them later. But nevertheless, right, it was the Nehruvian idea that sort of ideology that prevailed for the most part, and that is actually reflected in many of the developments that we witnessed in Bangalore in the immediate years of the after 1947. Okay. Now, I'm going to start here by presenting, okay, evidence from one of sort of a prominent sort of Nehruvian legacy, right? Nehru sort of gave this country, right, an import substitution led industrialization model where the public sector enterprises played a very crucial role, right? And the first public sector enterprise that was established in India, right, after independence was Indian Telephone Industries, or ITI as it is called today, right? And that was established in 1948 in Bangalore. Now, the thing is, and ITI actually had a monopoly over all sorts of telephone equipment, everything from end user equipment to the telephone switches, right? And that monopoly, that state control is reflected in how ITI managed to do or did very well for itself till at least until the early 1990s, right? You can see and these are all sort of in constant rupees, so you can see the graph, the orange bars are revenues, right? The blue bar is profit before tax. But suddenly, in the early to sort of mid-90s, the graph sort of takes a downturn. That is interesting, right? Now this is the other phase that we were talking about. If you look at sort of India's software revenues and exports that started to rise from the mid-1980s, the blue bars are the revenues and the red bar is actually exports. Right? Now, one of the intriguing things is that at around 94, 95, the very first year that ITI had a loss in its entire history, that was also the year that the Indian software industry started to, or was celebrating its $1 billion in revenues. Now, why $1 billion is an altogether different question. What's sort of sacred about that? It could be 900 million, but they were all celebrating hitting that $1 billion mark. Okay? The question is, why was it that when the software industry was doing well, okay, that ITI was starting to go down the tubes? And there's more than a sort of a coincidence, because if you look at the product mix of what ITI was actually offering, you'll see that almost, roughly say about 65% of what ITI was producing was actually switching equipment. You see this number here? Oops, sorry. Okay, by the mid-1990s, okay? And most of that switching equipment was actually electronic switching, right? Now, electronic switching equipment, okay, or 80% of the cost of electronic switching equipment is actually software. So that raises the question, why is it that when ITI's primary product, okay, whose primary input was actually software, okay, was driving an industry just beyond its sort of walls to $1 billion mark, etc. Why was it that ITI itself was going down the tubes? Right? So that is the central question. And this is where I'd like to make the argument that while the state has actually played a role, it played a very different sort of role in different sort of phases in the history of Bangalore. So it's not about whether the state played a role or not, but I think one of the things we really have to understand is how is it that the state played a role and why is it that these things differed. Okay, so see, we used to have other forms of switching earlier like Strowger and crossbar, but these were essentially metal bashing. The level of sort of software is very minimal. It was not until electronic switching came along that you had a huge software content, and that was ITI's primary product. The question is, why did they start to go down the tubes? Okay. Now, to understand why sort of ITI came to be and sort of its genesis, it's useful to look at the visible hand of the Indian state and the developmental role it actually attempted to play. Now, I'm not going through an entire policy history of what happened in India, but I'm just going to cherry pick for the to make the sort of the analytical point here. Now, when we sort of gained independence, the science and technology infrastructure in this country was rather limited. There was the CSIR labs. The CSIR itself was established in 1942. There were a few universities. Okay. And then, of course, after independence, Nehru was a firm believer in science, and policy making was influenced by the premise that in an underdeveloped country like India, science must be made the handmaiden of economic progress, with scientists devoting their work to augmenting productivity and ending poverty. So thus you also had the Scientific Policy Resolution of 1958, which was meant to foster, promote and sustain the cultivation of sciences and scientific research in the country, and to secure for people all the benefits that can accrue from the acquisition and application of scientific knowledge. And from science you moved on to industry. So you had the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 and 56, which laid the foundation for an economy in which the public sector would occupy the commanding heights of the economy, as Nehru called it, by grouping industry into three categories. One was where the government thought there were sort of industries that were strategic in nature, where the public sector was given the pride of place. Areas like, and many of these sort of firms that resulted or emerged in Bangalore belong to that category. I'll provide you with a quick list. A second, where public sector efforts would sooner or later, would initially supplement private sector capability and then eventually sort of bring them under public sector control. And then third, light and consumer goods, which was left to the private sector. Consequently, if you look at sort of the, how sort of these things sort of emerge, from our point of view, if you look at how or what was going on in Karnataka, if you look at it particularly in the area of electronics, you'll see that although Karnataka's share declined from 50% in 1971 to about 18 or 19% in 1994, it was still a very dominant force in the country. And these were, if you go back to 2000, these were some of the prime establishments that were in the cities, right? You had ITI established, sorry, there's a typo there, 1948, you had CDOT that got established, you had BEML, Bell and HAL that was established under the Ministry of Defense, BHEL and HMT under the Ministry of Heavy Industry and Public Enterprises, and 9 out of 49 of DRDO labs were in the city, right? Then you had CDAC under the Department of Information Technology, NAL, and the Center for Mathematical Modeling and Computer Simulation, CSIR labs, and then of course you had ISRO and the Department of Space. Right? So you had an enormous concentration of science and technology in this city. But what I'd like to argue is that there was also this sort of, Nehru's ideas in a sense didn't fall out of the sky, right? And they were not necessarily, quite often people argue Nehru is sort of this influence of sort of the Fabian socialist because of his education in the UK, the influence of Mahalanobis. Yes, all that is fine, and I'm not sort of quarreling with any of that. But there's also another important strand that influenced Nehru's thinking that comes from the old Mysore kingdom or modern day Karnataka. So that is Mysore for you, a map from roughly 1946, just before partition. This is a larger map. I'm sorry if this is not very clear. Okay. Now, in tracing sort of the Mysore lineage, as I call it, you had the sort of the state-led industrialization of Mysore, led by 3 prominent Diwans. And I think a little explanation here is very useful and important. I mean, Mysore was a standout case in sort of pre-independence India as one of those states which was under indirect British rule, which took enormous initiative in sort of industrializing and transforming itself. We'll come to that in a little while. Just list some of the initiatives that they took, and then we'll try and understand their significance. There were all these infrastructure initiatives. A lot of railways were laid. Of course, the British were laying them, but in the sort of the states under indirect rule, Mysore was by far a leader, right? India's first hydroelectric power station at Shivasamudram in 1902, and in fact, I remember, I think in 2000 or 2001, when Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric, was here to inaugurate what's now called the Jack Welch Center of GE, he spoke very proudly about how GE's generators had powered Shivasamudram and how their equipment was still sort of being used. Bangalore became the first city to be electrified. Krishnarajasagar Dam in Mysore to irrigate Mysore and Mandya districts. State Bank of Mysore was established to sort of finance a lot of the industrial initiatives, infrastructural initiatives, and the Indian Institute of Science, Mysore University, and UVCE. It was then called the Bangalore College of Engineering. The industries and firms that were established, you had the privately owned Kolar gold mines initially, then the sandal oil factory, soap factory, the Bhadravati Iron Works, okay, Remco, Radio and Electrical Manufacturing Company, Mysore Porcelain, the aircraft factory, and so on. Okay. Many of these subsequently were nationalized and became part of the sort of the Nehruvian vision. For instance, the most prominent of which is, of course, the aircraft factory that was started by the Walchens in 1940 to service British aircraft that were in combat in Southeast Asia. After independence, that aircraft factory was nationalized and it became what we now call Hindustan Aeronautics. Okay? So many of these subsequently got nationalized, or for example, Remco and Mysore Porcelain were merged with BHEL, your Bharat Gold Mines, State Bank of Mysore, of course, became a nationalized bank in 1969, and so on. Okay. Now I'm going to focus on just Sir M. Visvesvaraya, who's probably the most one of the most important figures in this period of history. Now, he believed, like Nehru, in the importance of establishing this industrial economy. He believed in this process of what is called infant industry protection to kind of nourish a local industrial capability and capacity. And there was this famous slogan of his, which is oft repeated, industrialize or perish. Right? Then he published the book Planned Economy for India in 1934, which is a crucial influence on the Congress Party's 1938 National Planning Committee, which incidentally was held by Nehru. And Mysore itself became, over a period of time, a role model for the Swadeshi movement, because they could actually point to this particular territory, which was under indirect rule, which had taken the initiative and was attempting to transform itself industrially. Right? So it became sort of a pre-independence poster child in that sense. Now, the establishment, you use this as an example. The establishment of the Bhadravati Iron Works, despite technical challenges and distance from markets, and I'll explain this to you briefly, was driven by a desire to produce a key metal and thereby industrialize Mysore. Thus, the plant made no profits between 1925 and 1939. In other words, the idea was, how do you bring about industrialization? This is not about being commercial. This is about establishing industrial capability and capacity, right? Now, there were technical challenges and distance from markets. Mysore, when they decided to go ahead with the Bhadravati Iron Works, that was because in the Baba Budan Hills they had very good iron ore, but there was no coking coal. Question was, could you import it? Possibly, but Mysore had no port, no access, right? You had to get it possibly from northern India. So what they decided to do was to use charcoal from the forests of the Western Ghats, which turned out to be a lot more expensive. Right? And then the markets, many of which were sort of up north or in the industrial centers, had already been captured by Tisco and Indian Iron and Steel in Burnpur. Right? So in that sense, these guys in Bhadravati had both sort of very high production costs, and their marketing costs and access to markets were also severely hampered. But nevertheless, the state decided to subsidize that production, okay, until 1939, and it was only then that they made any profits, because they felt it is very important to actually create that capability. It was not, this was infant sort of nurturing an infant industry in the state, which was considered, and an industry that was considered to be a critical input or a raw material for various other industries. In fact, it was in 1939 or 1940, I forget the exact date, that Visvesvaraya actually led a delegation to Michigan, to Ford, to see if they could establish an automobile plant in the state, so that there would be end use for the steel that was coming out of Bhadravati, right? But they didn't succeed. Fortuitously, they managed to get the aircraft plant, right? The only thing that came out of that delegation, I think, was the Hindustan Motors plant in Calcutta. Okay. Now, one of the things, I think, the connection that I'd like to make here is that material well-being, okay, was being sought through a very particularist economic nationalism. In other words, I'll cut my nose to spite my face, even if it means, putting up with losses for year after year after year, right? There's a very particular economic nationalism. We have to build this capability and capacity. But it was also done to seek a more sort of universalist sociocultural recognition for pursuing a developmental teleology inspired by the West. In other words, we are not modern, we are not there unless we industrialize like advanced, we are not sort of like European countries or North America, right? So there was a sort of this tension between the particularist and the universalist that they were trying to sort of negotiate. And the similar tension, for example, is also evident, I would argue, in Nehru's call to build a Chandigarh to heal the wounds of the partition, right? by asking Corbusier, the architect, to build a city that would be unfettered by the traditions of the past. Right? So you're essentially trying to sort of negotiate that tension between the particularist and the universalist. And you see that trade between Visvesvaraya and the other Divan and the Nehruvian vision that we adopted after independence. Sorry. But there were limits to the Nehruvian optimism or the Nehruvian vision. And I just sort of list very briefly some of the things that actually started to strangle that vision and to ensure that it didn't sort of blossom as it might have. We, for example, had the Industrial Development and Regulation Act of 1951, which made licensing mandatory. It was meant to direct resources to industries of national importance and prevent concentration of power, economic power. But it only created what the great Chakravarti Rajagopalachari called license Raj, permit Raj, and it proved completely inimical to any innovation and entrepreneurship. Right? Then there was the Indian Patent Act, right, which was amended in 1970 to reduce protection to foreign patent holders. And the net result, while there may be sort of good reason why you had to modify the Patent Act, the net result was when you went overseas to shop for technology, because of the nature of the Patent Act in the country, right, we often got stuff that was already on the way out. Right? Then you had the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947, which basically said that you needed government permission if you wanted to sort of retrench workers in any establishment with more than 300 workers, and that amendment in an amendment in 1982 lowered that figure to 100 workers. But permission was rarely granted. And we'll see the consequences of all of this for what is going on in ITI. Right? And then you had the Statement of Industrial Policy in 1977, which restricted financing and licensing of new industries in cities with populations greater than 500,000 as per the 1971 census. The argument was you can't grow in cities that are large, right? 500,000 was really an arbitrary number, right? But then you have to go and locate in other places so that you contribute to development in so-called backward areas. Now, what all of this did, okay, we'll sort of look at what it meant for ITI, right? Now, on the left you have a map of ITI, the location sort of ITI's manufacturing facilities and offices, and on the right you have the main sort of plants, the products that they manufactured and the dates that they were actually launched. Right? So Bangalore actually goes back to 1948, as I already mentioned. They started to make the sort of Strowger exchanges with a Belgian subsidiary of AT&T, of Bell, right? And this was in 1948. Now, the goal was that through import substitution-led industrialization, the public sector would play the role of the technological vanguard and develop the next generation of technologies. Sadly, what happened was in 1967, when they went for the cross-bar exchange, they went back to the same company for technology. Right? That happened in 1967. And meanwhile, a plant was opened in Srinagar in 1970 to make electronic branch exchanges and telephone instruments. And there was also a plant that opened in Naini. Right? Naini, of course, many of you might know, is just outside Allahabad. Right? And there's an obvious politics to it because that's where the Nehru family was. Right? That is where the transmission equipment plant was located. Right? One of the things this did was that ITI, even by world standards, was small, but it only served to fragment that manufacturing capacity and deny them any economies of scale. Okay? Then came this plant in Palakkad, okay? 1976, right? But a really cruel blow that ITI suffered came in the late 70s and early 80s, right? In the late 70s, when Bangalore had already switched to crossbar, which was a more advanced sort of form of electromechanical switching equipment, ITI went and opened a Strouger plant in Raebareli. And for those of us, or for those of you who know, why Raebareli is important, that was Mrs. Gandhi's constituency at that time. Right? So they went ahead much after Strouger had been was being phased out in Bangalore. They went and opened another Strouger plant in Raebareli. Even worse was that while negotiations were on with Alcatel for bringing in the newest version of electronic switching systems into the country, negotiations that started in 1982, right? The technology, the plant was put in place in 1985, okay? Even as those negotiations were going on, they opened a crossbar plant in Raebareli, right? It just completely knocked the stuffing out of ITI. Another aspect, another problem was that because Strouger and crossbar were being phased out of Bangalore, okay, the logical thing to do was would have been to establish the electronic switching systems plant here. But what happened, unfortunately, or fortunately, was that it was established in Mankapur. And Mankapur is in Gonda district in eastern Uttar Pradesh, and ITI, because it was the constituency of a very influential Congress MP at that time, and the party and the company had to actually spend an enormous amount of money creating basic physical infrastructure in that place, right? And then Bangalore was simply told to wait, right? So you had this sort of a very, if you look at this, the kind of, this is the sort of the spatial manifestation of the ideas that were prevalent at that point in time, right? Or how sort of the post-Nehruvian transformation sort of distorted some of these things.
What is this EC?
Sorry?
This EC, what is that?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's Electronic City here.
Oh.
Okay, they opened a plant here too. That's where I work. My campus is there. All right, they opened a plant there, yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. Now, let's look at where ITI's primary employment was. Right? If you look at, by around 1990, we were having this chat just before this talk. Ram was pointing out these large public sectors employing 30,000 people, and ITI was employing 30,000 people. Right? More than 50% of that was actually in Bangalore. Right? More than 50% was actually in Bangalore. Then you had the other plants where the employment was provided. Okay? Now, this is what's interesting is this. Now, if you look at, given the sort of the product mix and the employment in ITI's various plants, right? What you see here is that, let's start here. If you look at where Bangalore is, this is Bangalore for you. Sorry about that. Yeah. This is Bangalore for you. Right? It had amongst the lowest revenue per employee. Right? Whereas you take Mankapur, new technology meant you had much greater revenues per employee. Right? And even better still, Electronic City, where they brought in new technology, electronic switching systems and so on, and a lot of it from another subsidiary, the Center for Development of Telematics. That's a story that I'm not necessarily going into here, but nevertheless, whenever you were able to employ new technology, the revenue that could be generated per employee was far greater. And Bangalore, despite being the oldest, right, 40 years after it was established, was actually at the bottom of the pile, almost. Now, why was that? While Mankapur was opened, right, and this large plant was being set up, right, you had crossbar and Strouger being phased out in Bangalore, right? Now, in 1985, the same year Mankapur opened, this obsolescence of crossbar and Strouger in Bangalore meant they had 2,750 employees who did not have anything to do, right? And despite the efforts of the company to slowly sort of reduce that to redeployment, retirement, etc., by 89-90, they were still left with almost 1,500 employees whom they were paying for literally nothing. Now, given the nature of the Industrial Disputes Act and so on, they could not be terminated, nor were they willing to move, or could they be asked to move to Mankapur saying, here's a new plant, go and work there. The argument is, for those of you who know Kannada, Mannina Maga, I won't move there. Son of the soil. Okay. What's even worse is that because electronic switching requires a lot more skill than just metal bashing, right? If you look at the qualifications of the people, 70 or nearly 3/4 of them had less than high school, had completed less than high school. So you were stuck with a labor force, right, that was hardly qualified. You couldn't do anything with it. Almost 1,500 of them you were saddled with. But at the same time, you were hiring people in places like Mankapur. Okay? So it's really not a surprise that ITI slowly started to go down the tubes. What also happened from the early 90s was that thanks to sort of broader policy changes, right, when we started to invite foreign direct investments, the mother sort of the department of ITI, which is the Department of Telecommunication, said, sorry, we're no longer going to give you exclusive access to equipment. You have to compete with the likes of Alcatel, Ericsson, and others. Right? So it really became a sort of a double whammy for the company. Right? So, okay. And this is sort of reflected in this graph. So if you look at ITI's sort of reliance on the Department of Telecommunication for its revenues, you see by 93-94, it was almost 95%. 95% of their revenues came from the Department of Telecommunication. If it dipped later, it was because the DOT said, I'm not going to buy from you, or I'm not going to give you exclusive access. And for all these sort of the talk about import substitution-led industrialization and building new technology, even by sort of the mid-90s, more than 40% of ITI's imports were reliant on imports. Now, in a world where you have sort of a global economy, relying on sort of or buying components, etc., from other parts of the world is par for the course. However, right, if all your production is actually going in, this is the exports, right, barely goes beyond zero. In other words, you're essentially importing, you're unable to transform that in any significant fashion to make it valuable to international markets. No, it's not because there was no research and development capability in this country or at ITI. Okay, there's a very specific anecdote I'll talk about later, but I mean, for this, I'd interviewed many chairmen of, many past chairmen of ITI, heads of R&D, and so on. They all said, look, we had some of the best and the brightest in the country. The problem was, how was the state actually allowing you to function? You were told to go locate wherever, according to somebody's women fancy, whether or not made any sense, right? Quite often research projects would be initiated, but quite often in Delhi somebody would think, oh, we have to go abroad, do some shopping for some new technology and come back. So the project would be killed. Because even with electronic switching, there were a lot of very interesting initiatives within ITI, which the R&D people felt, given a little more time, they would have allowed it to transform and blossom. Right? That didn't happen. Right? So the state, through various sort of forms of sort of intervention, really ensured that the very first sort of plant or firm that came out of the Nehruvian vision was gradually throttled. And if you want to really see how sad the outcome is, just go to Krishnarajapuram today. A thriving plant that once buzzed with activity, right, is virtually quiet. And in real terms, ITI is producing today less than what it did in the early 90s, even to this day. Okay. This sort of threw up a number of policy dilemmas. Right? Now, the whole dilemma of import substitution and self-reliance was sort of and that sort of locally manufactured equipment were either import dependent and technology dependent, right? Anyway, you bought it from somebody else. Or if they relied on sort of locally produced components and inputs, they were typically obsolete, in part due to the inability to license state-of-the-art technologies. So in a sense, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Just to give you one example, when the Department of Electronics was established in 1971, our electronics production was 230 million, comparison to South Korea's 140 million, right? Within a decade, South Korea was nearly 4 billion, and we were not even 1 billion, right? The story today is, of course, I don't even have to sort of raise that issue. So these are some of the policy dilemmas. This is dilemmas that were sort of became increasingly obvious, and how the sort of the Nehruvian vision became choked. A certain form of state intervention did not really pay off, or paid off in very perverse ways. So you had a technology policy statement of 1983, which while reiterating technological self-reliance and indigenous technology, also emphasized the need for internationally competitive technologies with export potential. Now, this latter bit was not there earlier. This is sort of growing realization in the late 70s, early 80s. But the telecom equipment industry and the nascent software industry took very different paths to international technologies and exports. I've shown you what happened in telecom equipment, especially in terms of what happened to ITI. Now let's sort of turn our attention to the software industry. Now, the road to sort of software exports, right? Now, we had pretty much missed there was a big globalization of the semiconductor industry in the 60s and 70s. That's what led to the rise of countries like South Korea, Taiwan, etc. Right? And there were a group of sort of increasingly sort of frustrated bureaucrats at the DOE who were saying, this is not on. And there are two people, I think, who played an especially important role. One was the late Shigiri, and the other was Vittal. Right? And they dreamt, right, that India would become to software what Taiwan and South Korea were to hardware. And they said, look, we have the skills, relatively sort of well-trained, relatively low cost, let's see what we can do about it, right? And once they got the political backing, right, with the arrival of sort of Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister, within 15 days of Rajiv Gandhi taking office, the computer policy of 1984 was announced, right? That eased sort of local manufacture, availability of computers, recognized software as an industry, made it eligible for various allowances and incentives, and it lowered the duties on software import and made software exports a priority. This is a state priority. Right? This was followed 2 years later by the Computer Software Export Development and Training Policy, which adopted what they called a flood in, flood out approach to increase India's share of world software production. Firms in India were given sort of liberal access to global technologies to encourage thousands of small software companies in the country, thereby increasing export and local development. Right? What is very critical here to note is that the state actually said, we are not going to get into the act of production, like we did ITI or other companies. Right? That is critical. Industry was to be independent, with government stepping in to provide only promotional and infrastructure support. Right? Overall, policies were an explicit rejection of ISI and the ideology of self-reliance in this particular sector.
ISI is import substituting industry.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I think it's international, inter-services.
No. Thank you for pointing out, sir. That was fun.
Import substituting.
Yeah, I assume some of these sort of acronyms in my work. Sorry. So, the thing is, one of the things that I like to highlight here is that the state played a very crucial role, and people in the industry, some of them acknowledge it. Ironically, when I was actually doing my doctoral fieldwork in the 90s, I ran across this very prominent academic at a very prominent or eminent institution in the city who said, we do well in IT and beauty only because the government doesn't interfere. And beauty was referring to a couple of World, Miss Universe kind of things. Now, it was just astonishing that a person of this stature could be both theoretically uninformed and empirically clueless about what was going on in Bangalore. But nevertheless, this was the attitude. People thought, and this was, no, if this comes from a Times of India or something, with all due respect, I'm sorry. No, I hope nobody's here. Or any other newspaper. Okay, that's okay. Okay, that's okay. But you don't expect that from a scholarly, you don't expect that from a scholar of repute. But this was the general consensus, ignoring the role that the state had played. And there was more to follow. Okay. Now, while the state had done this, exports started to go up, right? But in this phase, that is in the roughly from mid-80s to about 1991, exports involved no more than body shopping, or the practice of sending local programmers to customer sites. Okay? Essentially, I know somebody there who wants 50 programmers to do something, hire 50 people here and send them. It is glorified labor arbitrage which takes place on our construction sites. Nothing very different. That's what they do, right? Except that these fellows have a B.Tech or M.Tech or whatever. Now what this did was to sort of underutilize the skills of well-trained professionals, and you're only going to compete on the basis of low wages. Right? That became your selling point. That really was it. Now the official encouragement that was given to body shopping at that time reflected a very limited understanding of the industry among policymakers amidst the sort of the euphoria of initial growth in software exports. Right? And okay, software is seen as high tech generally, okay, with little need for policy support. Okay. Actually, if they had probably understood it very deeply, they would have probably killed it. That's what I like. Vittal put it very nicely. And this, I'm quoting Prof. Sen, who used to be formerly on the Planning Commission. He says, until in a wonderful article that he wrote in I think 95, 96, he said, until 91, 92, there was virtually no policy support at all for the software sector. Even the term benign neglect would be too positive a phrase to use in this connection. This is despite the initiatives of the mid-80s. So what the state then did, and this was very crucial, with industry feedback, which at that time had formed this organization called NASSCOM in 1988, with feedback, the software technology parks were established in 1990. These are essentially export zones dedicated to the software industry, offering financial incentives and data communication facilities for firms to offer offshore services, right? That is service provision from India as opposed to going to customer sites. Now, there's a very interesting story as to how this actually happened, right? Industry wanted it. At that time, Mr. Vittal was Secretary DOE, and I was interviewing him, and he said, turn off the tape recorder. He said, I'll tell you how it really happened. He said, he went into a meeting, okay, of secretaries, called by the cabinet secretary at that point of time. And then he said, we want to set software technology parks, we need these data communication facilities. The DOT promptly objected, saying, our territory, back off. Data communication facilities is not information technology, right? But then Vittal persisted, and then the cabinet secretary said, suppose I give you permission, will you guarantee me $500 million of export next year? That previous year they done 100 million. Vittal said, if I missed this opportunity, there'd be no hope. I simply said yes. And he said the rest is history. They didn't make 500 million until 2 or 3 years later. But there has an enormous amount of sort of opposition in the state, but the state also decided to move ahead to sort of respond to the kinds of demands that are being made in the industry, by the industry in a way that is very different from the earlier era. Okay. Now, this is from the 90s. Today there are some 50 plus software technology parks, and we've also changed policies and so on. I'm not going to get into all of that. But the earliest, there were 4 software technology parks that were set up in 1991-92, one in each zone. Again, there's a whole politics of location to that I'm not actually going to get into. One in Bangalore in South Zone, Gandhinagar in the west, Bhubaneswar in the east, and Noida up north. There are a couple of others that came later. But nevertheless, the decision to set up these software technology parks was vindicated in the sense that from 92, 93 to 99, by the turn of the century, the share of exports that was actually going through the software technology parks rose very dramatically to nearly 70%. Because that's what industry wanted and that's what they got. Right? Now, soon after the STPs came, there are of course other advantages that reinforced the infrastructural advantages that the industry gained. Crucially, of course, in '91 you had the balance of payments crisis, major shift in economic policy, new industrial policy, and of course the devaluation of the rupee was very important because it made our exports a lot more affordable for people who were buying it, right? Trade liberalization, etc., and crucially the welcoming of foreign direct investment. Now, even earlier, right, from the late 80s, you had a trickle of foreign investment coming in, especially in the area of ICTs. And the first company or first major sort of investment in this in the region was from Texas Instruments. And why did Texas Instruments actually come here and how did they do it? They simply went to ITI, wiped out the entire microelectronics division. First 15 employees came from there. They cleaned them out. And soon after, companies came and cleaned out Bharat Electronics and other companies. Okay? It showed that the skills were there, but they were not being valorized in ways and means that we could have used for certain development goals. Now, while many of these sort of benefits had already sort of were there for the software industry, there were some special benefits that started to emerge later in the 1990s. Income tax exemption on profits from service exports. Essentially, any money you make, it's yours to keep. Profits. Elimination on import duties on software and permission to grant American and global depository receipts linked employee stock options in 1998. In other words, you could get employee stock options that were dollar denominated as opposed to just rupee stock options. And so what you see there is that in the 1990s, you had the data communications infrastructure of the software technology parks, significantly reinforcing the sort of increasingly liberal economic policies in the country, and exports started to grow very rapidly. They hit 1 billion by 96. By 2000, they were already hit 4 billion. Right? And you had these sort of large software factories that emerged in the country with infrastructure, technology, quality processes, methodology, etc., of the customer workplace. In other words, there was really no need to send your folks overseas. A lot of the work would increasingly be done locally. Just focus on this first, the table on the left. And here too you see how over that decade of the 1990s, the share of on-site services gradually declined, right? And the share of offshore services increased, and other products were also sort of increasingly a part of our export package. It was not just software services, right? And these, just to sort of see, these are a lot more lucrative financially for the companies that indulge in their exports. Of course, there were also state policies in places like the US that played an increasingly influential role, right? Which we should acknowledge, which is that in 1990, the US Immigration Act made it possible to issue a new set of visas for people with special skills, right? Originally, the so-called H-1B visas, which are now sort of being much debated about in the US, were meant to fill people in specialty occupations like teaching, nursing, etc., where there was a huge shortage in the US. But guess what? Very quickly, the people who sort of filled them up most rapidly were people from India, the vast majority of whom were software engineers, right? So you see by 94 we were number one. And actually if you extend the data on L1, which is about intercompany transfer, a variant of H1B, by 2006 there also we were number one. We continue to be number one under both categories. What this did was to ensure that people go back and forth. There was a flow of ideas and connection between the domestic information technology industry and what was happening globally, in a way that did not previously exist, for example, in the telecom equipment industry. You were living like a frog in the well, for the most part. The flows of ideas, right, connections with customers, etc., were simply not there. Other technologies, new options, new possibilities were simply not there. This is what it enabled. Now, where was all this happening, right? So by 2000, this is a rather crude indicator of where the companies were located. Bangalore was sort of, I looked at sort of the data on sort of headquarters of companies, which is certainly a very crude indicator, like I said, because many companies have development centers in many parts of the country. To give you one example, the largest software exporter in the country is Tata Consulting, which is Bombay based. But where is the largest development center? It's Chennai. So it's a very sort of a crude indicator, but nevertheless, it sort of helps us sort of understand or sort of look at the question of what is it that made Bangalore an attraction, how much of an attraction was it, and what are some of the forces that are actually driving it. Right. Now, typically, okay, while there's no doubt that Bangalore is the largest center, typically you see people laying out a laundry list of why things are happening in Bangalore, right? So you have institutions like ISC, you have the public sector, etc., etc., etc. That's all fine, right? But think about it. Like I said, TI came to this city, right? Wiped out some of the key people in ITI. The manufacturing, the guys in manufacturing were probably not worth hiring, given their education, given what they were used to, right? These companies needed something different. So you might be able to get your first few employees from the public sector with the right kind of capabilities, but after that what? Where are you going to get that from? Right? That is one. The other thing that we have to remember is that while people often talk about ISC and other educational institutions and so on, can I just, okay, other institutions, what we also have to ask in that connection is the presence of an institution good enough? Because people very easily draw these connections saying, oh, in the Bay Area they have Berkeley and Stanford. Silicon Valley is close to them, and therefore, here you have ISC, therefore this must be the Silicon Valley of India. The problem is people forget that the institutional connections, the organizational connections that exist between Stanford and Berkeley to Silicon Valley are very different from the way Indian institutions have historically functioned, academic institutions. Right? They've been relatively ivory towers, right? With very little connection, with very little sort of connections to the outside world, to industry. So the greatest contribution of an institution like IISc, which is almost inevitably invoked, is that you provided really high quality, well-trained people to the labor market. But IISc is also small. Where is the industry going to grow? The answer to that is the fact that if you take the Karnataka and sort of the nearby states, right, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra, and Maharashtra, you see that by 2000, these four states, right, accounted for more than 60% of the engineering colleges in the country, AICTE approved colleges, and they were producing almost or more than 2/3 of the graduates in the country. And those, all told, they barely account for about 20% of the population. Now, there's a very separate politics to why these states initially took the sort of lead in establishing all these engineering colleges, caste politics, and so on and so forth, that I will not actually get into. But nevertheless, what you actually witnessed was within a 500-kilometer radius of Bangalore, you had more than 2/3 of the engineering graduates of this country. So in a situation where you had free mobility of labor, you had a reinforcement of initial advantages. A public sector, though declining, offered initial labor, reinforced by this labor coming in from the engineering colleges and the presence of the STPs. Right? Now, at least until 2000, this was the picture. There have been other changes that have taken place, which I will not sort of get into right now. Now, so the state, okay, let me sort of pause and make a couple of statements. So I'd like to sort of reiterate that the way the state sort of intervened in the telecom equipment sector was very different from the way it intervened in the software sector. And many of what we saw in telecom equipment were also not things that were sort of out of the blue. They had certain strands that actually could be traced to a pre-independence era. But the state actually forgot to do a couple of things for which at least until 2000 we paid a stiff price. First, let us look at the table on the left. Right? until the mid to late 90s, let me first say this. What the state actually forgot to do was to think about demand side conditions. In other words, you can produce everything that you want, but who's going to consume it? How is it going to be consumed? These are very critical questions that need to be posed and thought through. Okay? On the left is the telephone densities per 100 population. Okay? So whether it's 1950 or 1994, we are right at the bottom of the totem pole. Right? Because until then, until the sort of the mid-90s, telecom was actually considered a luxury. Right? It was not until the mid-1990s we realized the importance of what good communication facilities could do. Right? I mean, today we take it for granted. Right? We're proud that we've got a billion mobile phones and all of that. But I grew up in a situation, in a period when it took 10 years to get a phone. And I'm sure many of you did. Right? Because the state did not think of it as a... So what happened, it also limited what ITI could produce, where its markets were, and ITI, because of the quality of its products, would also not export anything. So the scales were limited. Okay? And that same sort of, I would call it error, was actually even sort of reproduced in the latter period, when if you see by 1994, India had the lowest PC penetration in the world. In other words, you had no option but to export if you were in software. Who's going to buy your stuff? Right? There was no realization as to what it is that software could do to transform your economy, whether it's healthcare, medicine, education, etc., etc. We needed to export, we just did that. Right? We were also lucky in the sense that through the 1990s, there were a number of sort of global demand conditions that fueled the demand for software written and developed in India. To just give you 2 or 3 examples, one was the commercialization of the internet in 93-94, the first big internet boom. Right? Indian companies sort of flooded that. In 1999, you had the euro conversion problem. So n number of sort of prices in about a dozen currencies had to be converted from the Deutschmarks, the liras, whatever, into the euro. And of course, the biggest opportunity of all came from the Y2K problem in the year 2000. Right? All of these were extremely labor intensive. Right? And given the labor costs that were prevalent in the primary markets in Europe and North America or even Japan, Indian companies are able to move in fairly quickly. Right? And that is one reason why they grew. So despite the absence of a local market, given the international conditions and the state support for production, these guys are able to aggressively move and conquer the international markets. Okay? So this is sort of the broad sort of portrait I'd like to paint. And before I sort of conclude, I say, look, what is it that we're looking at? If you want to think about what's happened in this region, okay, you cannot think of it without the role of the state. The question is, it's not did the state act or did it not act? The question is, how did it act? What is it that it did at different periods of time? And what is it that was happening nationally? How did they take a specific spatial and local manifestation that sort of gives this a very specific and unique characteristic? So I think I will stop there. That's it, and I'll be very happy to take questions. I can hear you. Okay.
Thank you very much for the very informative, very insightful presentation. I have 2 questions. The first one concerns the company which was set up in the old previously stated myself.
Yeah.
You can go back to that slide. We had this porcelain factory.
Yeah.
Now this
reminds me
of a similar industrialization which happened in Prussia. Under the patronage of William II.
Right.
And it had a very similar contour of Royal Fort and a cooperation between the Royal Fort and the scientific institute. the second thing which this reminds me of, I'm not sure if it's relevant in the case of Mysore, is the Bengali Swadeshi entrepreneurship, which was driven by a spirit of nationalism and kind of imposed substitution.
Right.
We can also make it.
Right.
So, and a lot of the imperatives of Bengal Chemical was not profit, but that didn't make it. So I see the parallels, and this might be worth exploring if you're going to set up that. My second is a simple question. When I speak to a lot of young software professionals today, many of them are going abroad to work for startups. And is that going to leave a big platform manpower for the local industry?
Okay. Shall I answer them now, Venkat, or do I answer?
Yeah, I think we can just go through that quickly.
Go. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the first point about the Prussian example, I mean, the work of Alexander Gerschenkron brilliantly documents that, and I'm very familiar with that work, what happened in Prussia and so on, Russia, etc. One. Secondly, as far as the Bengal thing, the Bengal movement is concerned, you're right. What's unique about Mysore, see, a lot of the princely states were not necessarily major supporters of the Swadeshi movement, but it got sort of appropriated by the Congress party to say, hey, these guys can do it, because that was going on in British India. This wasn't sort of a relatively autonomous effort to undertake this this transformation. To answer your second question, the thing is, the situation today has changed very drastically, right? For one, A, there are a lot of startups here. B, it's no longer a question of, earlier when people migrated or left, right, it was like, goodbye India. I come to visit my relatives. Now, for example, the work of people like Annalise Saxenian has shown, you have people who are called Argonauts, who are able to capitalize on advantages that are available in both countries, go back and forth, right? Take advantage of the comparative, what economists call comparative advantage, and are able to have a foot across both countries. So I would not necessarily see this as a loss, right? If anything, this can also be a gain, because you're bringing in certain ideas which we may not necessarily find in our immediate neighborhood.
Anyone else?
Your timeline sort of stops at 2000.
Yes.
So, how are you seeing, and I know it's not history, but how are you seeing 2000 to now, and then the, forward for this region and for the other spatialized concepts?
Yeah, I think, see, there are two things. One of the things that we have to bear in mind is the technology has changed very dramatically. There is this whole phenomenon that I alluded to without specifically mentioning, is convergence. So we no longer think about communication equipment, software, etc. in very distinct terms. The other thing has been from a policy perspective. There's this growing acknowledgement that you can't use this technology only for elite markets, right? So there are efforts to sort of look at underserved markets, look at problems in India. See, all these guys until 2000 or even 2005, the first goal, if I set up a software company, I have to, sell in Boston or San Francisco. Now, increasingly, they're saying, can I develop products and services, right, for markets that have previously been unexplored? And this is happening for a couple of reasons, right? And even multinationals are doing that. What's happening is, nationally, you see, there is, first and foremost, there are demographic issues. Population growth in major, the advanced countries is flattening, if not declining. So where are the future markets going to come from? This is one. Secondly, many of them were used to previously do things like, sell obsolete products. If something had 10 features there, I'll sell 5 features here, and it's about 20 years behind 10, but I'll throw it. But people are no longer willing to buy that. The other thing is, if you're coming here because you think there's a large market, you're salivating at that prospect, the purchasing power is just not there. And therefore, the design axioms of your products and services that you use for Europe, North America, Japan are no longer applicable. So you've got to start from ground up, right? And that means you've got to think about, completely reconfigure what is it that you need to do. Since you asked, I'm just going to take the liberty of saying a little more. You've seen some very, very strange things happening from the vantage of 2000. Okay? A lot of multinationals today are working with NGOs, interestingly enough, right? So they make very strange bedfellows. Why? For multinationals, NGOs are tree huggers and do-gooders, at least 10, 15 years ago. For NGOs, multinationals represented all the evils of capitalism. Right? Now, why do they get into this embrace? Because for multinationals, looking at the prospect of like a 1.2 billion market or whatever, they have no clue. They have fabulous technologies, they know everything, but you can't sit and understand how a guy who earns less than $2 a day is able to get by, okay, when your product costs $25. Right? What is it that you do? How is it that you design for somebody? Right? So you have no clue. The NGO, on the other hand, is working with many of these communities for a long time, and they have what Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge of a lot of these communities, understands what they need, right? And it is this sort of marriage of convenience. I'll tell you what these guys really need, okay? But the NGOs don't have the technology. So you're seeing increasingly this sort of, coming together, if you will, of people who are able to provide some of this sort of understanding of the needs of certain communities that companies want to address, and NGOs that have been working with communities seeking access to technology. And there are many, many examples, and this might sound like a bit of cheap marketing, but I wrote a book on this last year, so I'll stop there before I get into do anything more vulgar. So there are significant changes that have taken place. Also, there was one point there, which is, the 2001, 2002, there was a major international crisis in terms of demand conditions that also provided a nice cutoff. Yes.
So, one feature of the software industry is human resource intensive and capital not so intensive.
Right.
And from our perspective on this campus, we would be very interested in what are the conditions that might cause similar change, but in a different context, the biotech industry, which is actually capital intensive in addition to requiring high technical skills and the rest. So, from your study of this industry and others, what are the kinds of bottlenecks, policy and on the ground, that are essential to overcome to have that kind of flourishing in biotech?
Okay, actually I'm a little reluctant to get into this because I'll tell you why. The simple thing is that if you talk about, the moment you talk about biotechnology, it's a very large area. There are a lot of ethical issues that come into question, right? There are, for example, you look at, designing of sort of, technologies that might be used on humans, etc. There are a whole bunch of ethics issues that, so it's not just saying, let's produce, let's go sell. It's not as easy as that. The software industry was a lot easier, right? And therefore, it's much trickier, okay? And not having studied that deeply enough, I don't want to necessarily put my foot into my mouth and sort of make a complete idiot of myself at NCBS. Please, just spare me. No, but we can, see, the thing is this, right? One of the things is that, but having said that, with that big caveat, right? What I would like to sort of point out is that today in India, a lot of the regulations of production are actually gone, and we are doing for most industries, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, right? Especially and even in biotech. I think the issue now, increasingly, is not about are we promoting them certain industries well. It's about saying are we putting in place adequate safeguards from being ripped off globally. In the software, in the sort of the information technology industry, a big concern is privacy, right? And that is taking on an ethical dimension, right? So likewise, I would reckon from, yes, there is capital intensity, etc., which the state can actually support. That's not a big issue. But are you able to put in place, when you're welcoming foreign direct investment, right? And you're actually, international actors, are you able to is enough safe? The pendulum has to some extent swung to the other side, where you want to make sure that your resources are being harnessed. See, the other larger question here is, what are the developmental goals that the state still has? What are the goals that it wants to sort of address? Right? And let me give you some of the tensions that exist here. We all take great pride in the fact we're sending people to, we're sending Chandrayaan, this, that, etc. Fine. We are a nuclear power. But we are also there are about an estimated 350 to 400 million people who are illiterate. Right? Economic nationalism leads us to sort of pound our chest about these things, rocket launches. But we also get very defensive when the next World Bank report says, you guys are messed up with health and education. So what is it that we want to defend? What is it that these territories that we want to defend and these sectors? So those are sort of larger issues that we needed to be debated. And in that, within that, how does biotechnology fit in as a particular priority? Okay, in this case, software became a priority in the mid-1980s, and then we had an industry, a set of people who were, you know, what shall I say, who succeeded and who sort of drove government policy. But today the government has taken a much more hands-off thing. Should it be the same way in the biotech industry, you know, until we grow? I know, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, we were quite successful, especially in generics and so on, particularly in the 70s and 80s and even to this day. But in the biotech industry, because the nature of technology has also changed, right, in the technology industry. So I know this is a very broad answer. I'm sure it's not very satisfying, but I don't want to sort of get into a sector that I've not really studied.
Balaji, I just wanted to go back to the historical outline, early parts of your talk. And you, this is of course not new to you and not new to some other people in this room, but for the younger people here. You know, two things. One is context, especially for younger people who are used to the demonization of Nehru. You know, why did the state occupy the commanding heights of the economy in the 40s and 50s? And I think it's important for people to be reminded or to be informed if they never knew that even the private sector, Indian private sector, believed in what you call the infinite industry argument. That the Bombay Plan of 1946 said, we don't have the money, we don't have the capital.
Correct.
You please build the dams, you please have the steel plants, you please build the highways. Hamare bas ki nahi hai, we can't do it. Right. So that's the first thing. All right. Now, however, while that policy was probably you know, inevitable and had to be done from the 40s to the 60s, in the 60s, I mean, you mentioned you have one slide or at least one reference to ICT and how South Korea was behind us in maybe 70 or something. Right, right. Now, I think that is the period in which, I mean, from the point of view of our economic history, I mean, most people, when they're, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, criticizing government economic policy, most people wrongly target the 40s and 50s when we had no other option, and even the private sector wanted us to go in a certain way. The late 1960s was the time when the state could have been an enabler instead of choking people more. You know, for example, and again, this is, as I said, more for other people, not for you, because you know all of this. But if you go back to your slide on the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, right? So it says certain sectors only public sector, certain sectors are mixed, third sector only private sector. Now, what Indira Gandhi did was not only to nationalize in sector 2, but even in sector 3, to have big modern bakery, so-and-so hotel, so-and-so this side, and to mess up there, right? Now, so in retrospect, I mean, those were really 20 lost years. I mean, you know, that's something which I just wanted to just, I said,
Ram, I completely agree with you. I didn't mention the Bombay Plan because I was, you know, because so many, no, you're absolutely right. In fact, you know, there's a wonderful book on development planning in India by Sukumar Chakravarti, brilliant economist, brilliant book. He writes at that time, this is what economic planning, this is the nature of economic planning that was being considered all over the world. So he said you can't blame Nehru for that, even if you wanted to demonize Nehru. That is one. Of course, the private sector wanted it. The third thing that Sukumar Chakravarti points out, which actually led in part to the crisis of the 1960s, was he said we treated agriculture as what he calls a quote-unquote bargain sector. Bargain sector. That's what he calls it. He said we thought agriculture would take care of itself, we'd feed our populations, but come the 1960s, we were faced with two severe back-to-back droughts. Right? That was also, we didn't pay enough attention to agriculture. Nehru focused entirely or almost entirely on industry. Okay, so that led to a conjuncture of sort of circumstance in the 1960s, or other political circumstances, etc. I completely agree. The 70s were a ruinous decade. You cannot blame Nehru for that, right? There are other things that were going on in the country that made a mess of things. The reason that I mentioned these policies in the 50s and the 60s was how they got taken, distorted, and they did cast their shadow across the 70s and the 80s. That is the whole point. That is the whole point. But I am in complete agreement with you. I don't think you can, the only person, see, and I think, and I mentioned Rajaji here specifically because Rajaji saw the limits of some of the Nehru's problems, right? Yeah, he saw that. That's why he came up with License Raj, Permit Raj and walked out of the Congress party.
One, again, anecdotal thing, since this is a Bangalore in the nation talk, and you mentioned the ITI plants in Mankapur, Raebareli, and maybe two in Raebareli.
Naini also.
Naini also, yeah. You know, my uncle, who is still alive at 90, a very distinguished public sector engineer with the Air Force, and then worked with ACL all his life and ran the big plant. I remember him telling me in the early 1980s, they had to build a new plant. And, Indira Gandhi was MP from Raebareli and Sanjay Gandhi was MP from Sultanpur next door. And they said it has to be there. So I remember uncle telling me, he said, look, we told them it's the Indo-Gangetic plain. The soil is, firstly, it's closer to Pakistan. Secondly, the soil is soft. You can't try plains, when it's such loamy soil, you have to have some rest. He said, sorry, you choose. It has to be, out of 543 districts in India, you have the choice of either Raebareli or Sultanpur. That's how the ACL experts were.
No, this is true. I mean, if you look at the sort of the logic of location in the country and particularly how it hurt the public sector, and it hurt them really, really badly, right? You had no components. You had components you had to supply to absolutely the boondocks, right? How is it that you can expect that a company like ITI, and these guys were being, to flourish, these guys were being run from Delhi, literally, right? So he said it was not possible for you to do, like a former CSS Rao, the late CSS Rao was former, he says, it was not possible for you to do any sensible production planning, right? Suddenly you will get some idiosyncratic directive from Delhi. He said, done, that's it. And he said, and another former R&D head told me, you want a 5,000 rupee component, audit will tell you you can't. He said R&D will cease for 6 months because you can't import it. So these are the kind of sort of, absolutely. Yes, sir.
In the interest of time, we'll just take one more question here and then we can hopefully...
The trade unionism as well of the public sector, just patronize the politics.
You know what, I'll just address that. 80-81, there was a major public sector strike in Bangalore. All the public sector was affected here, right? But the interesting thing, there's a wonderful book by Dilip Subramaniam on public sector in Bangalore. The very interesting thing is the relations between the public sector management and unions was not that antagonistic because both had a very cushy relationship. It was not like the private sector. It was not like what was going on in Bengal, right? They were relatively, I scratch your back, you scratch your back, we get everybody's job is protected. That was the real, and I spoke to trade union people. They said, look, the pressure on the production floor is not as intense as it is in the private sector. There were other factors that led to that 1980 strike, but I don't want to get into that now. Yes.
You mentioned, so in the context of these ITI plants and all these various places, how it hurt the efficiency and the economic competitiveness of the business, and you've made a strong case for that. For either the ITI or for some other cases, did it actually have any of the intended consequences of economically making a significant impact on the surrounding area? I mean, even if things were, as you just said, that the conditions were not great in these factories there, was it the case that it ended up being a boon for the surrounding areas, or was it a complete boon?
No, I'll tell you, there's one strand of this presentation that I chose to leave out, which I could add. All the public sector in the country were forced to support what are called small industries and ancillary industries. Certain share of the revenue had to be offered for production to small industries. The idea was you would also nurture small industries around you. That's why if you go to all these plants, you'll find a plant, SSI, a small industries estate right outside the public sector. Okay? But what happened was that because orders were guaranteed, many of these guys were running, these are all former public sector employees. Okay? And anyway, the technology in the main plant was not that great to write home about. There were significant investment constraints. So you were given a drawing and told to make it without asking any questions. So in other words, the technological upgrading that could have been possible was not there. So when the mother plant died, many of them simply shut down. So you can see these ghost industrial estates outside these public sector plants in most parts of the country even to this day. It was very tragic. So the impact and influence which could have been there, they were all started with good intent, but over a period of time they declined very rapidly.
Uniformly, was there a single success story among them?
At least not in Bangalore. ISRO is a very different case, but that is a very, the sort of the logic and politics of ISRO, the space program, is very different, but I don't want to get into that here. We can talk about it offline.
One last question.
Hi sir, I am Yashwant, I am Monsoon School student. Sir, even though Mysore Sandal company was established quite before independence, so what made this company so successful and still exists today?
Okay, now you're asking about a company that I've really not studied. So the thing is, see, the larger issue is this, right? So if you actually support certain kinds of products, okay, which are unique, and the sandal soap in this country continues to be unique, and you're actually able to provide market support, they merged two factories, the sandalwood oil soap and the sandal oil factory and the soap factory were merged as the Karnataka soaps and detergents factory. It's on the way to Yashanpur, right? So the thing is, if you're able to do certain things, you're accepting certain kinds of rationalization, you produce something unique. ITI was producing stuff that anyone could do it. What's the big deal, right? So you're doing something unique, and even to this day, sandalwood soap is something I take as gift to colleagues when I go overseas, for instance. You know, because it's a nice thing to offer. So there is some value, novelty value. That is one of the reasons I would hazard a guess. But there might be other reasons.
Thank you so much, Balaji. Let's give him a warm hand. There is tea outside, and hopefully Balaji will stick around to talk to you guys if you have any more questions.